It is a great privilege for me to come all the way from Manipur, flying with my former Chief Minister, to be in the midst of a great civilization called Tamil. And the drums that started the spirit, the music that really moved the meeting, I can feel the thousands of years of history of Tamil people. And why it is so painful to remember how when Tamil brethren are slaughtered, not in hundreds, but in thousands, just a few years ago. My discipline is human rights, and I was trying to understand from human rights what has happened there. And I had an opportunity to travel to the north of Sri Lanka in 2015 after the bloody war have taken place. And I could see the trauma in the hearts and minds of the people in Jaffna, totally desecrated, and the emptiness with which people were living, and the fear that still continues to be there. For those who have died, they have died, but for the people to remember and live with that trauma of really unspeakable atrocities that went through to their near and dear one was terrible. And as they say, a trauma, if it is not transformed properly, gets transmitted. And I see how that trauma, those people in North Sri Lanka was suffering, that I saw and personally experienced, I mean, about 7 years ago, still reverberates among the Tamil community here in Chennai. I can see how it got transmitted because this trauma was never addressed, this trauma was never transformed, there was no effort to heal this trauma. And it even goes intergenerational. It's not going to end here, but this celebration of the genocide or the observation of genocide will continue for many, many years if there is no tangible solution. If this narrative of the Tamil history, even if it is only in Sri Lanka, doesn't have a happy ending, let me tell you, this observation will continue for the next 100 years, at least. Because this is what has been experienced, that when you are exposed to a highly traumatic situation, and if there is no proper way of addressing those trauma, then it goes from this generation to the next generation. And this is scientifically proven because even grandchildren of people who were in the Second World War, in Patan March in Philippines, or the Vietnamese veterans in the American Army, even their children continue to suffer that because what you experience, you get transmitted to your loved ones. So if that's a very small trauma compared to the trauma that the Tamil population have suffered, and particularly a people with a history, it is very difficult to erase such kind of experiences. It's not going to go easy. I know the first attempt by the human rights community, the United Nations, the Secretary General at that time established a commission called the Accountability Commission. A group of experts looked into the situation of what happened in the beginning of the war and at the end of the war. And they clearly concluded that there are clear allegations of violations of not only human rights, but also war crime and crime against humanity. But the Sri Lankan government, Rajapaksa, was very smart in establishing what they call Learning Lessons and Reconciliation Commission. LLRC was what Rajapaksa and his government crafted, and this was presented to the world as if that was the true story. Unfortunately, the international community accepted that report. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights accepted that report and agreed to continue to work with the Sri Lanka government and try to respond to issues. Unfortunately, the matter seems to have died down because of one crisis after the other came. Now everybody is talking about Ukraine, and there is really no mind space to relook at Sri Lanka. But one very good book that has come out from a professor from Illinois College of Law, Francis Boyd Lee, entitled Tamil Genocide by Sri Lanka, have clearly argued that this genocide of the Tamil people that has taken place in Sri Lanka is a clear failure of the international community to respond to this. You may recollect that there is something called responsibility to protect. Human beings have to be protected by their states, by their government. If they fail to do so, the international community should help that government to protect the people. But if they consistently fail in doing so, the international community has a responsibility to act. This is called responsibility to protect. This has come out basically because of what happened in Rwanda and Burundi and how international community was just keeping silent. And in 2005, this international principle of responsibility to protect was established. A center was functioning called the Center for Responsibility to Protect. However, when the moment comes, theoretically talking about protection is one thing, but when it comes to taking a political stand to take action, unfortunately, the Tamil genocide happened precisely because this responsibility to protect have no takers. The idea was there, but unless and until there is a political will by a government to push that, unfortunately, nothing happened. And he clearly stated that this is a clear, I'm sure many of you must have gone through this book, but he clearly argued that this is a clear violation of the responsibility to protect by the international community. And therefore, he come to the conclusion that because the people were killed because they were people, they were not killed because they were committing a crime or they have done a theft or have was involved in a terrorist activity, but they were killed because they were Tamil people. And therefore, the fact that they suffered because of a people, they should be entitled to the right that every people is entitled to under the Charter of the United Nations, meaning all peoples have the right to self-determination, by virtue of which they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic and social development. And because there are no other alternative, and the very survival of the Tamil people today inside Sri Lanka, who have been suffering systematic structural discrimination for decades together, ever since the conception of that island nation, which sparked off into a civil war from 1983, he concludes that the remedial right to secede and to determine their own future and have their own political system and country remains a clear option precisely because they have suffered this genocide. But unfortunately, again, these are theories that academics can talk and write in their book, but to actually convert that into action, it requires action by the state. And because it violates all the Genocide Convention. Genocide Convention was one of the first conventions after the Second World War, because people were shocked with how Hitler was killing the Jews and was happening in different parts of the world. Sri Lanka is a signatory of the Genocide Convention. India is a signatory of Genocide Convention. And under the Genocide Convention, if genocide takes place in one of the signatories of the Genocide Convention, then one of the countries can raise that issue at the international court in terms of interpretation of whether there was actually a genocide or not. Unfortunately, again, there are no nation states who would raise this in the International Court of Justice, and therefore the matter remains there. So even though human rights today has developed as a very nice academic exercise where PhDs of the PhDs can be done, to translate it into action, we need political determination, political will from the nation states, which we see, unfortunately, is gradually lacking. And considering the precarious geopolitical situation that Aditya ji have just described, and the world is changing the world that has come after the Second World War seems to be slowly changing very rapidly. And in these new geopolitical politics, how would a genocide of a very, very deeply rooted people like the Tamils will be responded to in this scenario is something that is open to be seen. But I'm really glad that there is mobilization around this because we can never forget what has happened. Desmond Tutu once said in the context of the apartheid in Africa that we can never forget. We can forgive, but we can never forget. How do we forgive? By changing and making sure that a healing process takes place, and that healing process can be brought about only after there is an acknowledgement that something wrong has been done, and how do we get into that healing process. I think Government of India also needs to take a stand on this, and I would like to also join my brother Aditya in urging Annaji that perhaps it is time that India also need to stand up for certain values, or certain democratic values. If we also cave in to power politics, the big brother in the north is already 5 times stronger than us, 5 times richer than us. So if democratic values and human rights is an area where they can never challenge us, free press, civil society, meetings like this can never happen, even though they are extremely rich. And this kind of openness, debate, and like any other matured democracy, India should also stand up for what is right and true and what is democracy. And definitely the massacre of this thousands of Tamil is something that cannot be put under the carpet. And we from Manipur, at least having also gone through similar experience, not at this scale, but we are also under laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Recently, Modi ji have at least cleared some disturbed areas, but we also constantly deal with people as human rights activists coming from that very conflict-ridden area where the conflict has been going on for 60, 70 years. We are also coming across families who have lost their loved ones in clearly high-handedness by the state. So we know the pain, but of course this is multiplied. We are talking about 10 or 20 people killed. Here we are talking about 40, 50, 60, 70 people, 1,000 people killed. So that's of a different scale. And this is something that we need to take a stand and say, no, this cannot be repeated in this part of the country. Thank you very much. Our solidarity once again to the Tamils.